Okay, good afternoon, Philomatheia. This time we'll be discussing one of the topics that's included in the coverage of your upcoming examination this week and next week. Okay, so our discussion will center around syllogisms. Okay, narinig po ang boses ko.
Opo.
Okay, good. Okay, let's begin. So what is syllogism? Syllogism is a form of deductive reasoning where you arrive at a specific conclusion by examining two premises or ideas. Okay, so here are examples of syllogism. For example, you have the statement, all roses are flowers. This is a rose. I'm holding a flower. So the three components of syllogism includes the major premise. The first statement is what we call the major premise. The second statement is what we call a minor premise. And then the last statement is the conclusion. Okay? Again, you have three major components of syllogism. Okay? Now, let's talk about the different types of syllogism. Although mamaya po, I'll be letting you watch a video for you to understand the 8 rules of syllogism because syllogism follows a particular rule. Okay? So you have what we call, number 1, categorical syllogism. Okay, so what is categorical syllogism? Categorical syllogism follows the logic that if A is part of C, then B is part of C. Okay? O, example. Tingnan pong mabuti ha. Kasi i-analyze po ninyo whether the statement or the syllogism is valid or invalid. Kaya you have to understand the premise. Okay? So, sabi dito, the statement, all cars have wheels. I drive a car, therefore, my car has wheels. So, major premise, all cars have wheels. Minor premise, I drive a car. And conclusion, my car has wheels. Okay, is this valid or invalid? This is valid. Okay, kasi it's the truth, right? Lahat naman ng kotse ay may gulong. Nagmamaneho ako ng kotse, ibig sabihin, yung kotse ko ay may gulong. Okay? Kasi hindi mo naman yan mamamaneho at mapapaandar kung walang gulong. Diba? Oh. So, ganun ang pag-a-analyze po ha. Intindihin yung mabuti yung statement. Again, kailangan yung sabihin kung valid or invalid yung syllogism. So again, that is an example of categorical syllogism. Another example of categorical syllogism. All insects frighten me. That is an insect. Therefore, I am frightened. Okay, major premise. All insects frighten me. Minor premise. That is an insect. Conclusion. I am frightened. Question, valid ba yan or invalid? Any volunteer? Philomatheia. Yes, Loris May.
Valid po.
Yes, okay. So statement number 2 is also valid. Okay? So yan, naintindihan nyo na ha. Second type of syllogism is what we call conditional syllogism. Okay? Kanina, categorical. This time, let's have conditional syllogism. What is conditional syllogism? Conditional syllogism follows the pattern of logic. If A is true, then B is true. Okay? Sometimes conditional syllogism is also called hypothetical syllogism. Okay, so let's have the statement. If Katie is smart, then she will get into a good college. So major premise, Katie is smart. Minor premise, because she is smart, Katie will get good grades. Conclusion, if Katie is smart, then she will get into a good college. Valid, invalid? Any volunteer? Yes, Patrick Arsiaga.
Valid po.
Okay, very good. So this one is also valid. Okay? And gets nyo na. Next. Next statement. If Richard likes Germany, then he must drive an Audi. Audi ay tatak ng kotse ha. Brand ng sasakyan yan. Okay? Nagawa sa Germany. Okay, let us look at the major premise. Sabi dyan, the major premise is Richard likes Germany. Okay? Minor premise, Richard likes all German things. Conclusion, if Richard likes Germany, then he must drive an Audi. Question, is this valid or invalid? Volunteer. Intindihin nyo mabuti yung statement ha, bago sumagot. Tingnan mabuti. Any volunteer? Again, is this valid or invalid? Walang volunteer. O, tawag tayo. Larry Manalo. Larry Manalo, is this valid or invalid? Oh, wala si Larry, tulog pa. Yes, you're raising your hand. Loris May.
Invalid po.
Very good. Yes, this is invalid. Okay, ba't siya naging invalid? Hindi naman nangangahulugan na dahil gusto ni Richard ang Germany, parang gusto niyang tumira doon, he would be driving an Audi. Okay? It's possible na ibang brand ng kotse ang kanyang minamaneho or mamanehuhin. Diba? So it doesn't usually follow. Right? So again, this one is invalid. Next type of syllogism is what we call disjunctive syllogism. So what is disjunctive syllogism? Disjunctive syllogism follows the logic, either A or B is true. If A is false, then B is true. Okay, so let's look at this example. In the statement, this cake is either red velvet or chocolate. Since it's not chocolate cake, it must be red velvet. Okay, either statement. This cake is either velvet or chocolate. False premise, it's not chocolate. Conclusion, therefore, this cake is red velvet. Is it valid or invalid? Any volunteer? Again, is this valid or invalid? Yes, Shane Gibaga.
Sir, valid.
Again?
Valid.
Valid, okay? Kasi dalawa lang na may pagpipilian niya eh. It's either nga, di ba? It's either red velvet or chocolate. So kung hindi chocolate yon, therefore, red velvet yon. Okay? Sana, naiintindihan ha? Next, on the TV show Outlander, Claire's husband is either dead or alive. Since he's not alive, he must be dead. Okay, either statement, Claire's husband is either dead or alive. False premise, he's not alive. Conclusion, therefore, Claire's husband is dead. Anong sagot? Valid or invalid? Any volunteer? Yes, Gibaga?
Valid.
Yes, valid. Okay, kasi kung hindi naman pala siya buhay, therefore, patay siya. Diba? Okay, next is what we call enthymemes. Okay, what is an enthymeme? An enthymeme is one of the major type of syllogism, but is what's known as a rhetorical syllogism. Usually, ginagamit siya sa mga persuasive speeches. Example like debate. Okay, so tignan po natin ha. Obama wants to create a government-run healthcare. Obama is a socialist. Okay? So, major premise, Obama wants to create government-run healthcare. Implied, minor premise, socialists have government-run healthcare. Conclusion, therefore, Obama is a socialist. Is this valid or invalid? Anyone? Is this valid or invalid? Yes, Gibaga.
Valid po.
No, this is invalid. Okay, kasi hindi naman nangangahulugan dahil gusto ni Barack Obama magtatag ng isang healthcare na gobyerno ang mag-handle. Socialist na siya. Okay, because kagaya sa atin, ang PhilHealth, run by the government yan. No? Pero hindi naman tayo socialist country. So it does not follow that when a president establishes a government-run healthcare, he can be considered a socialist. Okay? So again, that is invalid. Next, cake increases sugar. Diabetics shouldn't eat it. Major premise. Cakes increases sugar. Implied minor premise, diabetics shouldn't have sugar. Conclusion, therefore, diabetics shouldn't eat cake. Valid or invalid? Yes. Sino yung unang nagtas ng kamay? Nasaan ka na? Arian Bueza.
Valid.
Again? This
Valid
is?
po.
Okay,
Valid.
valid. Yes, valid. Okay? Next. Meron tayo mga fallacies, syllogistic fallacies. Ibig sabihin, ito yung mga mali. Ito, pag hindi kayo marunong mag-analyze ng mga fallacies, mabibiktima kayo ng fake news. Okay? O kaya madali kayo maniniwala sa argumento ng kung sinong tao na hindi naman pala tama ang sinasabi. Okay? Because this syllogistic fallacies contains false presumptions. Okay? It happens when you make two general statements to validate a conclusion. Example, when you say that all dogs are mammals, cats are mammals, therefore dogs must be cats. Di ba? Invalid yung statement na yan. Okay? So, tutungin tayo dito. All crows are black. The bird in my cage is black. Therefore, this bird is a crow. Major premise. All crows are black. Minor premise. The bird in my cage is black. Conclusion, this bird is a crow. So this is automatic invalid. Okay, this is a fallacy. So therefore, automatic is invalid. Okay, why? Tama naman na ang lahat ng crow ay itim. But, hindi nangangahulugan na dahil kulay itim yung ibon sa kanyang bird cage, automatic crow na yon. Okay? Maaaring ibang breed ng ibon. Okay? Dahil hindi lang naman crow ang kulay black na ibon. Next, the scenery in Ireland is beautiful. I'm in Ireland, therefore the scenery must be beautiful. Major premise. The scenery in Ireland is beautiful. Minor premise. I'm in Ireland. Conclusion, the scenery is beautiful. This is also a fallacy because it does not automatically follow na pag nasa Ireland siya, nasa magandang bahagi siya ng Ireland. Malay mo kung nasa tambakan siya ng basura sa Ireland, nasa dump site. Diba? So again, this is what we call syllogistic fallacy. Okay? Now again, here's a video that will discuss the 8 rules of syllogism. I suggest you take lectures or screenshot of the PowerPoint or the lecture that you will see in the video. And then after po netong video na to, we'll have an activity. Okay? Kaya maganda po kayo ng pen and paper. Okay? Because this will be recorded. Okay, again, here's the video.
Sir, wala pong sounds.
It is important to note that when one gives what is an argument and how do we determine its validity? An argument consists of two or more propositions offered as evidence for another proposition. In logic and critical thinking, the propositions that are offered as evidence in the argument are called the premises, while the proposition for which the evidence is offered is called the conclusion. Thus, when one gives an argument, one is providing a set of premises as reasons for accepting his or her conclusion. It is important to note that when one gives an argument, one does not necessarily attack or criticizes the other. In this way, an argument can also be viewed as a support of someone's viewpoint. Now, arguments can either be inductive or deductive. On the one hand, an inductive argument is one in which it is claimed that if the premises are true, then it is probable that the conclusion is true. Hence, even if all the premises are true, inductive argument or reasoning allows the conclusion to be false. It is also important to note that inductive arguments go from the specific or particular to the general. In other words, inductive arguments make broad generalizations from specific observations. Let's consider this example. 90% of the mango seeds germinate in day 1, and in day 2, 90% of the mango seeds germinate.
Araw-arawin na ang pag-inom ng mas pinamurang Alin.
Snack time? Make it your kid's favorite Chucky time! Chocolatey bar.
Therefore, 90% of the mango seeds germinate. Based on this example, we can also say that inductive arguments are based on observations or experiments. Deductive arguments, on the other hand, is one in which it is claimed that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is necessarily true. And unlike inductive arguments, deductive arguments proceed from the general to the particular. Thus, a deductive argument or reasoning begins with a general statement or hypothesis, and then examines the possibilities to reach a specific logical conclusion. Here is an example of a deductive argument. Anybody who kills a person is guilty of a felony. Jim kills Jack. Therefore, Jim is guilty of a felony. Now that we already have a basic understanding of what arguments are, let's talk about syllogisms. Syllogisms are arguments that consist of three propositions which are so related so that when the first two propositions, that is the premises, are posited as true, the third proposition, that is the conclusion, must also be true. In other words, a syllogism is an argument arranged in a specific manner in such a way that it contains a major premise, minor premise, and a conclusion. Here's a classic example of a categorical syllogism. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Now, how do we determine the major premise, minor premise, and the conclusion? The major premise is the premise that contains the major term, while the minor premise is the premise that contains the minor term. The conclusion is the third proposition whose meaning and truth are implied in the premises. And how do we determine the major term, minor term, and the middle term? The major term is the predicate of the conclusion, while the minor term is the subject of the conclusion. The middle term is the remaining term which does not and cannot appear in the conclusion. Looking back at the example, then we know that the major term is mortal, because it is the predicate of the conclusion, and the minor term is Socrates, because it is the subject of the conclusion. The middle term is man, or man, because it is the remaining term and which does not appear in the conclusion. As we can see, the major term is in red color, the minor term in blue, and the middle term in purple. Now that we have presented the key concepts in arguments or syllogisms, let us proceed to the determination of their validity. Logicians have formulated 8 rules of syllogisms, but of course they can be expanded to 10 or reduced to 6. But let us follow what logicians commonly used, that is, the 8 rules of syllogism. It must be noted that all of the 8 rules of syllogism must be met or satisfied for the argument or syllogism to be valid. If at least one of the 8 rules of syllogism is violated, then the argument or syllogism is invalid. Here are the 8 rules of syllogism. 1. There should only be 3 terms in the syllogism, namely, the major term, the minor term, and the middle term. And the meaning of the middle term in the first premise should not be changed in the second premise. Otherwise, the syllogism will have 4 terms. 2. The major and the minor terms should only be universal in the conclusion if they are universal in the premises. In other words, if the major and the minor terms are universal in the conclusion, then they must also be universal in the premises for the argument to be valid. Hence, if the major and minor terms are particular in the conclusion, then rule number 2 is not applicable. 3. The middle term must be universal at least once, or at least one of the middle terms must be universal. 4. If the premises are affirmative, then the conclusion must be affirmative. 5. If one premise is affirmative and the other negative, then the conclusion must be negative. 6. The argument is invalid whenever the premises are both negative. This is because we cannot draw a valid conclusion from 2 negative premises. 7. One premise at least must be universal. And 8. If one premise is particular, then the conclusion must be particular. Now, let us examine some example of arguments and apply the 8 rules of syllogisms to determine their validity. Let us color the terms to avoid confusion. So, let us assign the color red for the major term, blue for the minor term, and purple for the middle term. Rule number 1 of the 8 rules of syllogism states, there should only be 3 terms in the syllogism, namely, the major term, the minor term, and the middle term. Let us validate this example. All stars are heavenly bodies. Angelina Jolie is a star. Therefore, Angelina Jolie is a heavenly body. If we analyze this syllogism, it would appear that the argument is invalid because it violates rule number 1. As we can see, the syllogism now contains 4 terms because the meaning of the middle term stars in the first premise is changed in the second premise. The term stars in the first premise refers to astronomical bodies or objects, while the term star in the second premise refers to celebrities. Let us consider another example. Every police officer is brave. Mike is a police officer. Therefore, Mike is brave. As we can see, this syllogism contains only 3 terms. Hence, this syllogism is valid in the context of rule number 1. Rule number 2 of the 8 rules of syllogism states, the major and the minor terms should only be universal in the conclusion if they are universal in the premises. Example: every philosopher is brilliant, but no terrorist is a philosopher. Therefore, no terrorist is brilliant. Before we proceed in determining the validity of this argument in the context of rule number 2, let me emphasize the importance of a basic knowledge about terms and propositions, especially their quantity and quality, for an easier analysis and application of the rules in syllogism in determining the validity of arguments. So, check out our separate discussion on terms and propositions. Link is on the card on the upper right corner on your screen. Now, let's continue. As we can see, the minor term terrorist in the conclusion is universal because of the universal signifier no. And since the minor term terrorist in the second premise is universal because of the universal signifier no, then the syllogism does not violate rule number 2 in the context of the minor term. However, the major term brilliant in the conclusion is universal because the proposition is negative.
You have 10 minutes to finish your research. You rush into searching on Google, then you find a title that sounds credible. You enter the page and start reading with all your...
As we already know, the predicate terms of all negative propositions are universal. But if we look at the major term in the first premise, it is particular, because as we already know, the predicate terms of all affirmative propositions are particular. In the end, this syllogism is invalid because it violates rule number 2. This is what logicians call the fallacy of illicit major. Let us consider another example. All artists are creative. However, all artists are weird people. Therefore, all weird people are creative. Because the major term creative in the conclusion is particular, as it is a predicate term of an affirmative proposition, then it does not violate rule number 2, because the rule is not applicable here. As we can see, rule number 2 is applicable only to universal minor and major terms. But if we check the minor term weird people in the conclusion, we learn that it is universal because of the universal signifier all. Since the minor term weird people is universal in the conclusion, then it must also be universal in the second premise for the syllogism to be valid. Now, if we look at the minor term in the second premise, it is particular because it is a predicate term of an affirmative proposition. Therefore, in the end, the syllogism is invalid because it violates rule number 2. This is what logicians call the fallacy of illicit minor. Let us consider a valid argument in the context of rule number 2 of the 8 rules of syllogism. No lawyers are liars. Greg is a lawyer. Therefore, Greg is not liar. This syllogism is valid in the context of rule number 2 of the 8 rules of syllogism because rule number 2 is not violated. As we can see, the minor term Greg in the conclusion is particular. Hence, rule number 2 is not applicable. Of course, if a rule is not applicable, then it cannot be violated. And if no rule or law is violated, then the argument is automatically valid. Now, if we look at the major term liar in the conclusion, it is universal because it is a predicate term of a negative proposition. But because the minor term liar is also universal in the first premise, because again, it is a predicate term of a negative proposition, then this argument satisfies rule number 2. Here's another example of a valid argument in the context of rule number 2 of the 8 rules of syllogism. Some lunatic easily gets irritated, but some insecure teachers easily get irritated. Therefore, some insecure teachers are lunatic. Both the minor and major terms in the conclusion of this syllogism are particular. For this reason, rule number 2 of the 8 rules of syllogism is not applicable. Hence, the syllogism is automatically valid in the context of rule number 2 of the 8 rules of syllogism. Rule number 3 of the 8 rules of syllogism states, the middle term must be universal at least once. Let's consider this example. All beans are leguminous. Mungo seeds are beans. Therefore, mungo seeds are leguminous. This syllogism is valid in the context of rule number 3 of the 8 rules of syllogism because the middle term beans in the first premise is universal. In fact, rule number 3 of the 8 rules of syllogism asks that at least one of the middle terms must be universal. Here's another example. Some lawyers are not studious. Marco is a lawyer. Therefore, Marco is not studious. As we can see, both middle terms in the first and second premise are particular. But because rule number 3 of the 8 rules of syllogism asks that at least one of the middle terms must be universal, then the syllogism is invalid. Rule number 4 of the 8 rules of syllogism states, if the premises are affirmative, then the conclusion must be affirmative. Let's consider this. All bodily beings are corporeal. Plants are bodily beings. Therefore, plants are corporeal. This syllogism is valid because it satisfies rule number 4 of the 8 rules of syllogism. As we can see, both premises are affirmative, and the conclusion is affirmative. Here's another example. Some students are lazy, but some Asians are students. Therefore, some Asians are not lazy. This syllogism is invalid because it does not satisfy rule number 4 of the 8 rules of syllogism. As we can see, both premises are affirmative, but the conclusion is negative. Now, rule number 5 of the 8 rules of syllogism states, if one premise is affirmative and the other negative, then the conclusion must be negative. Example, Most Filipinos are fiesta lovers. Diego is not a Filipino. Therefore, Diego is not a fiesta lover. This syllogism is valid in the context of rule number 5 of the 8 rules of syllogism. As we can see, the first premise is affirmative, the second premise is negative, and the conclusion is negative. Let's consider another example. Some students are cheaters, but some students are not lazy. Therefore, some cheaters are lazy. Now, this syllogism is invalid in the context of rule number 5 of the 8 rules of syllogism. As we can see, the first premise is affirmative, the second premise is negative, but the conclusion is affirmative. Hence, it violates rule number 5 of the 8 rules of syllogism. Rule number 6 of the 8 rules of syllogism states, the argument is invalid whenever the premises are both.
Hey everybody, I'm Teresa.
And I'm Sarah
from LG CTS Motorsports.
And we want to hook you up with this Jeep that we customized just for you.
Negative. Example. No idiot is rational. Kurt is not an idiot. Therefore, Kurt is rational. Obviously, this syllogism is invalid because both premises are negative. Rule number 7 of the 8 rules of syllogism states, one premise at least must be universal. Example, all rich individuals are hardworking, but some fishermen are hardworking. Therefore, some fishermen are rich individuals. This syllogism is valid in the context of rule number 7 of the 8 rules of syllogism because it qualifies the rule. As we can see, the first premise is universal. Lastly, rule number 8 of the 8 rules of syllogism states, if one premise is particular, then the conclusion must be particular. Example, some lawyers are professionals, but no criminals are professionals. Therefore, some criminals are lawyers. The first premise of this syllogism is particular, and the conclusion is particular too. Therefore, this syllogism is valid in the context of rule number 8 of the 8 rules of syllogism. That's it for now. Thanks for visiting us today for another whiteboard discussion here.
Just remember, philomatheia, what makes a statement negative or positive is the presence of the word no or not. Kapag may no or not doon sa statement or doon sa premise, that makes it a negative statement. Okay, basta may nakita kayong no or not. Again, that makes it a negative statement. Kasi baka may nagtatanong kayo, ano yung sinasabi niyang negative? Ano yung positive? Of course, kung walang no or not sa statement, automatic, the statement is positive. Okay? So sana malinaw po yun. Now here is, let's try the exercise, ano? Okay. So let's have the direction. Sabi dyan, kumuha po ng papel and ballpen, ha? In each of the following questions, two statements are given, and these statements are followed by two conclusions, numbered 1 and 2. Now, you have to take the given two statements to be true even if they seem to be at variance from commonly known facts. Now, read the conclusion and then decide which of the given conclusion logically follows from the given statements disregarding commonly known facts. So, give answer, pwedeng A, if only one conclusion follows. B, if only two conclusion follows. Follows means valid, ha? C, if either 1 or 2 follows. D, if neither 1 nor 2 follows. And E, if both 1 and 2 follows. Okay? So let's have number 1. Number 1 muna po. Tingnan mabuti. Sabi dyan, some actors are singers. All the singers are dancers. So, statement 1, some actors are dancers. Statement 2, no singer is actor. Now, tingnan mabuti kung valid or invalid, pareho, or walang valid sa kanila o isa lang. Okay na? So let's view the answer, no? Maging honest po sa pag-check, ha? Okay, the answer is A. Okay? Again, the answer is letter A. So only one conclusion is valid. Kasi mali yung number 2. No? That makes it invalid. Okay? Next, number 2. Sana po nagsasagot, ha. Number 2. All the harmoniums are instruments. All the instruments are flutes. So, statement 1 or conclusion 1, all the flutes are instruments. Conclusion 2, all the harmonious are flutes. You choose your answer. Sana nagsasagot lahat, philomatheia. Kasi kasama sa exam nyo to. Para matuto po kayo. Okay. Answer for number 2 is boy. Okay, or B. So, only 2 conclusion follows. Ibig sabihin, conclusion number 1 and 2 are valid. Next, number 3. Some mangoes are yellow. Some tikso are mangoes. Conclusion 1, some mangoes are green. Conclusion 2, tikso is a yellow. Minsan pagka meron kayong term na hindi kayo aware, pwede nyo i-research kung ano yung ibig sabihin ng word na yun, ha? Pwede kayong gumamit ng dictionary. Kasi wag kayo manghuhula. Okay, so for number 3, the answer is D. So walang valid sa parehong conclusion. Pareho siyang invalid. Okay? Next. Number 4. Some ants are parrots. All the parrots are apples. Okay, conclusion 1, all the apples are parrots. And conclusion 2, some ants are apples. Choose your answer. For number 4, the answer is option B. Okay. Again, option B. Next, number 5. Some papers are pens. All the pencils are pens. Conclusion 1. Some pens are pencils. Conclusion 2. Some pens are papers. Answer. Okay, answer is letter E. Okay, again, answer is letter E. Okay, meron pa po, ha? Next. Ito sasabihin nyo lang kung valid or invalid, ha? Yung makikita po ninyong statement. Okay, again, isusulat nyo lang kung valid or invalid. So let's have number 1 and 2. Ayan po, nakikita po ninyo sa screen nyo. Hindi ko na po babasahin, ha? Again, 1 and 2. Again, you're just going to write whether the syllogism is valid or invalid. Okay, are you done? Let's have 3 and 4. Again, 3 and 4. Okay. 5 and 6. Again, 5 and 6. Okay. Next. 7 and 8. 6, 7, 8. Next. 10, 11, 12. Again, 10, 11, 12. 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay. Next. 13, 14, and 15. 12 to 15. Okay, last item. Hanggang 17 lang yan. So 16, 17. Okay, let's check. Ready na? Ready na kayo siguro. Di sumasagot eh. Okay, number 1. Who would like to answer number 1? Any volunteer? Walang magbo-volunteer. Philomatheia, number 1. What's your answer in number 1? Ba? Gising pa ba kayo? Okay, number 1 is valid. Again, number 1 is valid. Number 2. Number 2 is invalid. Again, number 2 is invalid. Number 3. Number 3 is valid. Again, number 3 is valid. Number 4, invalid. Again, number 4 is invalid. Number 5, Number 5.
Invalid.
Okay, number 5 is invalid. Number 6. Number 6 is also invalid. Again, number 6 is invalid. 7. Number 7.
Invalid po.
Again. All rational people believe in rule by law. Some rational people are college professors. Some college people are believers in rule by law. Okay, number 7 is valid. Number 8. Number 8.
Invalid po.
Okay, number 8 is invalid. Again, invalid. Number 9. Number 9. Number 9 is valid. Okay. Again, number 9 is valid. Number 10.
Invalid po.
Okay, number 10 invalid. Again, number 10 invalid. 11. 11. Eleven is valid. Again, 11 is valid. Number 12.
Invalid po.
Okay, invalid. Again, number 12 is invalid. 13. 13 is
Invalid po.
invalid or valid?
Valid po.
Valid. Valid po yung 13. Again, number 13 is valid. 14.
Invalid po.
As Emerson said, all the world loves a lover. Now that I think about it, Susan is part of the world. I am a lover. Now that I think about it, Susan must love me. Okay, number 14 is invalid. Again, 14 is invalid. 15. 15 is invalid. Again, 15 is invalid. Number 16. 16 is
Valid po.
invalid. Again, 16 is invalid. 17. 17 is also invalid. Again, 17 is also invalid. Okay, paki-add po yung score pag tinawag ko, bigay sa akin ha. Again, pag tinawag ko, bigay po yung score. Arshaga.
14 po.
14. Cuevas. Cuevas. Wala si Cuevas. Kundangan.
13 po.
Ilan?
13 po.
1-3.
Opo.
De Guzman Patrick. Wala.
9 po, sir. 9.
Tagal-tagal sumagot. De La Cruz Christian Gabriel.
13 po.
Bilis-bilisan nyo at magta-time na. Dumayag. Dumayag. Wala. Enriquez.
Absent po.
15
Enriquez.
po, sir.
Ilan?
15 po.
15. Gatchalian. Wala. Gutierrez. Russell. Wala. Jose Joris. Jose. Wala. Lagutaw. Lagutaw. Wala. Manalo. Larry. Wala rin. Martin, Tristan. 15 si Larry Manalo.
14 po, sir.
14 ka. Okay. Si Moralde. 15. Poblete.
11.
Rizaldo. Wala. San Diego Jericho. Wala rin. Sotor. Renz. Wala rin. Villapuerte. Dylan. Wala rin. Alamodin. Wala. Ansures. Wala. Batalya.
17 po.
17.
Opo.
Binalya. Wala. Buesa. 15. Hindi ko tinatanong kung present o absent kayo, Patrick de Guzman. Ang kinukuha ko po ay score. Hindi ka ba nagsagot? Kando. Wala. Cardenas. Wala. Chua. Wala. David, Angel. Ann Kathleen Chu. Cardenas, ilan ka? 10. Si David, 14. Del Mundo. Duran.
15 po.
Duran, 15. Pedencio.
15 po.
Gibaga.
13 po.
1, 3. Gonzales, Rohana. 12. Javier. Absent.
Sir, si Jessel po, hindi niyo natawag.
Magbitang pa siya eh. Teka lang. Madalan.
16 po.
16. Magbitang.
Boys po yun.
Ba't nasa babae siya? Sige, magbitang. Ilan?
11 po.
Lalaki ka pala. Ba't nasa ano ka? 11. Mercado. Micaela. 13. Pariñas. Wala. Prinsipe. Wala. Ramirez. Wala. Ronidel.
13 po.
Ilan? 1, 3.
13 po.
San Miguel. Wala. Santibáñez. Wala. Talastas. Wala. Valenzuela. Wala. Zomil.
11 po.
Lazaro. Wala. Rios. Wala rin. Okay. Balik daw po kayo sa main room ha. Huwag mo nang lalabas. Goodbye and di yata tayo mag-meet next week kasi exam week pa yata yun. So good luck on your exam. Magantay lang po. Ipopost namin ng pointers to review. Okay? So goodbye, Philomatheia.
Thank you po, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.